Hello. Today we're going to look at Winston Churchill and his wartime leadership. And I thought I would start by looking at one of the very famous quotes that Churchill is associated with, and that is, "For my part, I consider that it will be found much better by all parties to leave the past to history, especially as I propose to write that history." Now, that's often misquoted by people who say that Churchill said something along the lines of, "The past will be kind to me, or history will be kind to me because I will write it." But that is a really important idea, and it's one that we're going to kind of come back to, this idea that Churchill is someone who shaped the way that history and perception has remembered him, and that the myths and the legends that surround him have maybe obscured a little bit of the truth about him. So, as I say, today we're going to talk about Churchill. We've already looked at Chamberlain and his fall and the reasons why he eventually resigned. The creation of the coalition government and the impact of Labour ministers is something that we'll kind of look a bit more at when we look at society. So that is not something that's going to come up. And Churchill as a war leader is the kind of thing that we're going to focus on. So there have been lots of questions about this over the past few years. So you get questions like, as a popular leader, his inspirational powers were beyond dispute. How effective was Churchill as a wartime prime minister? How much do sources B and C reveal about Churchill's effectiveness? Saviour of his country, how valid is this view of Churchill's wartime leadership? To what extent does Churchill deserve his reputation as outstanding international statesman? And evaluate the usefulness in source B and explain the strengths and weaknesses of Churchill as a war leader. So you can see that every question, the 2019, 18, 2016 and the 2012 one, are all about basically how good Churchill was as a war leader. The 2015 one is a little bit different. It's asking us about him being an international statesman, which is a bit more about the kind of relationships that he had. So you'd have to write a bit more about that and maybe a bit less about kind of things like the home front, which is something we're going to talk about for that essay. But generally speaking, the question is always going to be roughly the same. It's going to ask you how good a wartime prime minister was Churchill, and you're going to have to make an assessment about that. So in general, the Churchill topic is a pretty complicated one. There's a lot of information to it. Obviously, Churchill becomes prime minister in May 1940 and goes on to be prime minister almost up until the end of the war. It's just before the end of the war that Attlee takes over. So his premiership lasts pretty much throughout the entire war. So that's a huge amount of time, which means there's obviously a huge amount of detail. But what is true, even though that makes it hard, and it is definitely one of the harder topics, and if I was going to pick an essay to revise, this would probably be the one I would put lower down because it is so hard and there's so much detail required. However, you can use things from other essays in a Churchill essay, so there are lots of overlaps. For example, there's overlaps from the preparation for war bit, there's overlaps from the fall of Chamberlain bit, because you can compare Churchill and Chamberlain. All the military campaigns that we looked at can be brought in because you can talk about how good they were and how effective they were, and then that obviously reflects either well or badly on Churchill. You can talk about the economy and how well that was managed, and you talk about war and society, and you can talk about the 1945 election, which obviously happens at the end of the war. So there's a huge amount of overlap between this area, this Churchill topic, and the other topics. When we're talking about Churchill, as I said right at the start, his words and his speeches have come to kind of dominate the discussion and dominate the narratives that are constructed around about him. And as I said right at the start, there's a lot that can be said about that. There's this myth about Churchill that he's seen as this fantastic war hero, that he is, the archetypal, the perfect Briton. And there are definite arguments that can be made that that's not true, that Churchill had a huge number of failings and he had made a huge number of mistakes during the war. And you can talk about that in your essay, you can talk about in your discussions how that there's this myth and it's very hard to kind of cut through the myth in order to make a fair assessment about him. I think there's another quote in particular that's really useful when discussing Churchill, and that's one that comes right at the start of his premiership. He says, "You ask what is our aim? I can answer in one word. It is victory. Victory at all costs, victory in spite of all terror, victory however long and hard the road may be." And I think this is really interesting because although it was taken from his first speech as Prime Minister back in May 1940, he's right. He sums up the next 5 years almost perfectly. victory at all costs, victory in spite of all terror, victory how long and hard the road may be. It was a long, hard road. There was a lot of terror, and there were a lot of costs. And so we can refer back to that when we're writing our essays about this topic and say, you know, yes, Churchill delivered a victory, but at what cost? Was it worth the cost that he paid and that Britain paid? And that can be a kind of basis of your evaluation. So as I said, there's a huge amount of stuff that you can talk about, a huge amount of detail, a huge amount of events and interpretations and all that kind of stuff. And so there's loads of different things that you can look at when you're talking about Churchill. However, I think there are kind of four key areas that you should be looking at, and these are personality and leadership qualities, his military decisions, the alliances he had in relationships with other allies, and the home front. So I'm going to go through all four of them. Start with personality and leadership qualities. Basically, in this one, you're going to start off and significantly discuss speeches and the effect the speeches had. So, having a knowledge or being able to memorize a few of the kind of key lines from his speeches, and also understanding the context, so when they were said and what was going on in Britain and what the effect was for these speeches, can be really, really important. So, little quotes such as victory at all costs, which is the one we've just referred to, we shall fight them on the beaches, which is obviously another very famous line, and any man or state who fights against Nazism will have our aid. These are all very good quotes to remember. Any other quotes that you think that stick in your brain, anything that you're likely to remember, is good to have. But once you've used those quotes, putting them down is good, but it's the analysis and the evaluation that comes after that. So explaining why those quotes were said and what effects they had is really going to help make an essay really, really strong and make it stand out. In this section as well, you can also talk about how personally popular Churchill was, or how perhaps unpopular he was, and the ways that he was able to relate to the public or not relate to the public. Then military decision. Now, again, you could write a book about this. In fact, lots of people have written books about this, but obviously in a 50-minute essay, there's a limited amount that you're going to talk about, so you've really got to prioritise in this section, and this means picking a couple, maybe 2 or 3 important events, and then using them to discuss whether Churchill was an effective military leader, an ineffective military leader, or a bit of both. So there are loads, as I've said, to pick from. However, the ones that I would probably focus on are the Mels el Kabir sinking of the French Navy, the decision to take troops out of the kind of Mediterranean, the North African campaign, and move them to Greece, the delaying of the Second Front. Stalin and to some extent Roosevelt had been calling for a Second Front since around about 1942, and Churchill delayed that, and D-Day obviously doesn't happen until June 1944, and whether that was a success or failure. The bombing of Germany is something that Churchill was in charge of, and so you can talk about that and whether it helped to win the war, and you can also contrast that with the fact that a lot of bombers and resources were used to bomb Germany when perhaps they could have been used to help win the Battle of the Atlantic a bit earlier. You can talk about whether Churchill was effective or ineffective in appointing key military commanders, because there were some he appointed that were very successful, such as Montgomery, but there were also times when he sacked commanders, perhaps because he fell out with them, and whether this shows that he was an ineffective wartime prime minister. The invasion of Italy, which many people have since criticised, was definitely one of kind of Churchill's main ideas, something he really pushed for. And in this section, what you can do is, as well as talking about the events, you can kind of make reference to people like Alan Brooke, who was Churchill's main military commander, and how his opinion on Churchill was interesting, and that he thought that sometimes he was a genius and sometimes he was an idiot. And if you read Alan Brooke's diaries, there's a lot of, him going on about how much he hates Churchill, and then other times him talking about how wonderful Churchill is. So that's important. You can also get information from other British commanders, Montgomery or Mountbatten or William Slim, these kind of guys. Or you can also take information from the other allies, the people like Roosevelt or Stalin or things like that. And then following on from that, alliances and relationships. So this is where you're going to really look at mainly the relationship with the Americans and the relationship with Russia. But you can also bring in stuff here about France and the Empire if you've got kind of time and space, or if you think that that's an important focus. So in this section, you should be looking at the extent to which Churchill was able to balance the relationships with the Allies, and how far he was able to convince them to do things that benefited Britain. So when you're doing that, you can talk about things like the Germany First policy, how he convinced Roosevelt and the Americans to focus on defeating the Germans before moving on to the Japanese, which was obviously a success. But you can kind of contrast that with Roosevelt's decision to say that they wanted unconditional surrender, which was perhaps seen as a problem, and how Churchill kind of had to follow him in that, which suggests that Churchill was very much subservient, very much the underling. The references to specific conferences will kind of add a strength to this bit. If you've got a bit of a knowledge, you can say that that happened at Casablanca, or that happened at Tehran, or things like that. That's the sort of thing that really adds depth and thoroughness to an essay. You can also talk about the extent to which Churchill maybe sold the British out, that the Lend-Lease programme and becoming massively indebted to the Americans was something that's roundly criticised by many historians. And you can also talk about the kind of moral and kind of post-war problems caused by making deals with the Russians. For example, the Percentages Agreement, or sometimes referred to by Churchill as the Naughty Document, where he agreed to divide up the various parts of southern and eastern Europe after the war. And then the home front. Now, home front is something that Churchill perhaps ignored to some extent, and this allowed Labour politicians such as Bevan and Attlee to kind of take over and wield quite a significant amount of power. Churchill very much focused on the conduct of the war and relationships with the Americans and the Russians, and kind of left the home front to them. And so this meant that the Labour Party politicians were able to introduce a lot of policies and a lot of directives that were very in keeping with their sort of left-wing or socialist leanings. And to some people, this is a real problem for Churchill, a real kind of area to condemn him, because it meant that, first of all, Churchill allowed the Labour Party a kind of clear run to be able to demonstrate their effectiveness, which was a significant factor in their victory in the 1945 general election. And there are others who say that, the socialist policies, or however you want to refer to them, of the Labour Party strongly contrasted with Churchill's conservatism, and that by allowing Attlee and Bevan and others to dominate the home front, he abandoned his own principles. However, in contrast to that, there are some people who say, well, actually what happened was Churchill realised that Bevan and Attlee were both exceptionally competent ministers, and that their control of the home front allowed Britain to work more effectively during the war. And so while it did mean that Churchill had to forgo some of his principles, it also meant that that Churchill achieved a victory, and that can be described as the kind of victory at all costs that we referred to earlier. Finally, it's really important when you're writing an essay on Churchill to make sure that you're actually answering the question. As I said at the beginning, it's very likely, if a question like this comes up, that it's going to be some form of how good a wartime Prime Minister was Churchill. So you've got to constantly be arguing either that he was a good wartime Prime Minister, or he wasn't a good wartime Prime Minister, or there was a bit of both. So you can't just keep telling a story, it's got to be strongly evaluative. So there's got to be consistent references to the question. A lot of them, essays about this, they struggle because it's not targeted, it's just telling a story, and it can be a fascinating story, a very well written story, but if it doesn't evaluate effectively, then it's not a good essay. So you've got to constantly link back to the idea of whether Churchill was a good or a bad wartime Prime Minister. It's perfectly acceptable to come down in the middle and say there were some aspects that made him a good Prime Minister and some aspects that made him a bad Prime Minister, and kind of say he's a mixed bag. He had positives and negatives. That is a perfectly acceptable conclusion. It's also perfectly acceptable to say it's successful if you're going to talk about Churchill as a success. It's important to reference the fact that when he comes to power in May 1940, Britain is very much viewed as an underdog, and her defeat looks inevitable. By the time he's out of office at the end of the war, Britain has achieved an overwhelming victory. So that is something that you'll have to reference there. And if you want to talk about Churchill as a bad wartime Prime Minister, then you should definitely emphasise the fact that Britain paid a huge cost in the ultimate victory that they achieved, and that there was a huge loss in terms of economic power, military power, and also the imperial power. The empire was badly damaged or significantly damaged by the war. So coming to inclusion and answering the question is so important with these issues. Hopefully that is giving you a good idea of things that are required with the Churchill essay, and it will give you a good direction to go in when you are revising.